Welcome to the Kaleidoscope Podcast. I'm your host, George Salis. This podcast is all about shining a light on neglected writers who have dedicated themselves to innovative fiction. Past episodes have included the first ever audio interview with Alan Singer, the first ever audio interview with Michael Brodsky, and today I'm delighted to have popped the podcast cherry of the one and only REYoung. Rey is the author of 6 novels, including Unbabbling, published by Dalkey Archive in 1997, The Ironsmith, and, most recently, a trilogy that we'll soon discuss in depth, among many other topics. Rey was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and currently resides, so he claims, in a limestone cave beneath the city of Austin, Texas. Rey's writing is full of zany energy and metafictional play. In a word, his books are Pynchonian. In fact, Rey is almost as reclusive as Pynchon himself, and the author photo that accompanies this episode is also a first. His Facebook profile currently features a red-haired troll doll. Anyway, without further ado, I present our conversation. Hey Rey, how's it going?
All right, George, how are you doing?
Thanks for coming out of your limestone cave in Texas to be on the show.
Yeah, you're welcome. I come out of my cave to come into my closet of solitude to do this.
Awesome. Well, we're here to celebrate the conclusion of a trilogy that you wrote, starting with Margarito and the Snowman, and the second is Zol or Soul?
The pronunciation is kind of open-ended, and that was partially intended. In my mind, it would be pronounced Sol, more like the Spanish, and so then representing the sun, of course, but also a play on soul, S-O-U-L.
And then your trilogy ends with Da Snowbiz. From the get-go, did you know this was going to be a trilogy, or is it something that kind of took on a life of its own?
Yeah, the latter is more correct. I really had no idea. This began quite some time ago, during a driving trip into Mexico. I very quickly wrote out a number of vignettes that became short stories that were disconnected but seemed to be connected somehow, and so I became more interested. The stories themselves were just a little bit too earnest and in a sense cultural appropriation, and didn't really do a lot for me, and so but I felt a real attraction to the whole idea, and I began to develop this connective tissue, just free thinking, associations, and it began to develop into a book, and it was kind of very impressionistic and lyrical, that kind of thing at the time. And it just kept growing and changing and developing. The whole concept, the filmic aspect, Boom Weller, the crazy B movie director, developed kind of on its own and became a very useful tool for me to keep this book going. And it began to grow a lot, and I reached the point where I felt I wanted to get something out, and still didn't have enough control of the whole thing to understand what I was doing. And so the first book came about, Margarito. I found a point of closure, submitted it to Dalkey Archive, who had published my first book, Unbabbling, 20 years earlier, and John O'Brien took it, and so that began that. And then I continued to work on what became book 2 and 3 in following years.
Did you struggle with the structure as far as separating them into this trinity, or did that just come about naturally?
Well, yes, somewhat of a struggle. I think, there was this linear dimension, overall narrative structure that was developing, and I had a huge amount of material and trying to figure it out understand what really belonged where, first, second. The third volume was simply a coda at the time of about 50 pages. And I had really no idea that it would develop as it did, which is, I think, in the big picture, kind of very Fellini-esque and much more lighthearted, with the exception of some very dark episodes that almost always appear in my work.
And it turned out to be the thickest volume of the three.
Yeah, that's true, and I didn't really expect that, although, part of that is optics, because the original Margarito was published with 11-point font, and I have been going with 12 because that seems to be recommended, maybe for easier reading. But the truth is, if I have anything to do with this in the future, again, I would go back to the font that Dalkey Archive used, the 11 points, because I like that concise, compressed page and not wasting a lot of paper.
Our mutual friend Stephen Moore, I saw his review of one of the installments in the trilogy. And he, if I remember correctly, he has a hard-on like most of us do for big books. And he says that the reception would have been even more ecstatic, let us say, if it had been published in a single volume. What do you think about that, and what are the chances of getting a single volume in the future?
Yeah, Steve does like big books. Geez, I don't know about the possibility of that, because the current Dalkey Archive press directors, publishers own the rights to Unbabbling, and the two other books are separate volumes. Sure, if I had the opportunity, I would love to. I've heard a suggestion for an omnibus that would work fine. Just bound together, that would be fine for me. But the possibility, again, it's kind of outside of my, at the moment anyway, outside of my realm.
What do you think of the chances are as far as getting the rights?
Oh, I don't know. It might be mutually beneficial if somebody. That's one of the reasons why I ended up self-publishing these two volumes, because actually, the story with Dalkey Archive goes, it's kind of deep and wide. After John published my first book, Unbabbling, John O'Brien, in 1997, I was working and amassing a really large amount of material and trying to figure out what the hell I was doing with it. And about 10 years after Unbabbling, I finished a book called Inflation, and I submitted it to Dalkey, and John O'Brien was actually pretty excited about it, but his readers weren't. And so it went nowhere, and neither did I. And I at that time, was working on and off on Margarito as well as 3 other books, and I'm trying to figure out which one was going to be finished first. And John had actually, after he accepted and published Margarito, he contracted with me for 2 more books, which became Inflation and The Ironsmith. And I had contracts with him, and he had given me verbal agreements to publish the 2 second volumes of the trilogy. So all of that was in the making. And then his ship went down. The press was collapsing under his tenure. He was dying. He was becoming erratic, and as even more erratic, I should say. And it became obvious that he wasn't going to be able to publish these books or handle them. I had no idea what the outcome was going to be, and so I chose to take ownership, as they say, of my own work. And so I did that. Wise choice or not, I have no idea. But yeah, like I said, the ship was going down, and pretty much everybody involved in every level within the press itself, other writers, everybody. I think everybody suffered enormously with the demise of the Dalkey Archive press, at least in that presentation, that form.
And as I told you in our email correspondence, I've had trouble from the perspective of someone who wants to shine a light on literature and interview authors, and they kind of fight me every step of the way before they just totally ghosted me, and I never hear from the team in any capacity now. They were telling me that John E. Woods would be impossible to interview, that I'd have to go to Berlin or somewhere in Germany in person because he doesn't have email. Lo and behold, the Arno Schmidt Foundation gave me his email, and I was able to interview him very easily. And unfortunately, he passed not too long after that. But I think it's important to sort of preserve literature in that way. But I guess Dalkey is a shadow of a shadow and dealing with, like you said, the remnants of what was given to them. So it's just a big mess in general.
Yeah, just to finish on that, I don't think the blame for that lies entirely on the inheritors, the heirs to the press, Chad Post especially, have taken over, because the expectations are mighty high for what John and Brian had created and what he ultimately destroyed. I would say it would be asking an awful lot to put on somebody else's shoulders what he envisioned and what he had undertaken. Although I wish to God somebody would, man. I wish somebody would reanimate that vision and rebuild that enormous, incredible list of books, literature in translation across the board, literature. John O'Brien created an enormous, just a wonderful national treasure. And unfortunately, due to his capriciousness and erratic behavior, and this is something people who worked with him, under him, know much better. I think again the blame really falls with him, and I don't even mean to use that term because I think, like other people, I feel fond of John despite everything.
As far as John O'Brien, would it be fair to say he's somebody who was overambitious and had too much on his shoulders, so to speak?
I don't know what to say about that. I think it was more the execution. I think the vision was there. It was supportable. I think he made a lot of bad decisions. I think he was, in effect, created a Ponzi scheme, and he was a gambler. He took risks nonstop, and everybody else took those risks with him.
What do you mean in this context by Ponzi scheme?
Oh, man. He was getting grants to support the press, grants to publish translations from many countries, many nationalities and cultures. And so he would kind of live off of one grant to support the press while he was out drumming up more grants. And, this, I can't really speak to this that well because this is secondhand, to some extent firsthand, because I had talked to him about some of this. He told us what was going on, but he, I think he was always living on the edge in the press with him too. Financially, he was spending a lot of his own personal money to keep it going. And, there was kind of my sense from a distance, kind of a high on the hog living lifestyle that was associated with this, and maybe John felt entitled to that, and I would say maybe he was, because God, what he created was worth it, but that may have been part of his undoing.
Going back some, was Unbabbling your very first work?
Yes.
Can you tell me how you got into writing? Give me your origin story, because I'm interested in that.
My origin story goes back a long time. I thought when I was about middle school age, I was thinking about being a writer, and I was writing poetry and getting some praise from English teachers. And after a disastrous freshman year in college, flunking out, basically dropping out of college, I spent a hell of a lot of time reading and writing and thinking about things, and began to really want to write, but honestly just could not find the portal, the entrance into that world. And it took me quite some time of world experiences and banging my head against the wall, and a lot of wandering in the desert, in the wilderness, and
literally or metaphorically?
Kind of both. Metaphorically for sure, but literally lifestyle, jobs, basically lowest common denominator trying. I was refuting just about everything of society that I was raised with and led to believe in. I found most of it to be enormous lies, untruths, and not helping me one bit, and that included any conventional approach to writing literature whatsoever. Everything I heard was just deadly, it was just like kill yourself and, produce, what fits this mold, this standard, something you may have experienced in your life.
In university, I had some fiction workshops, and the professor was pleased when I started writing like him. His view of good literature, good writing, was whatever he was doing.
Yeah.
And I had to sort of refine my voice after that.
Yeah. That's kind of what I'm getting at least. Yeah. In fact, even I have a master's in literature in the writing option from Penn State, and it's kind of a bastardization of the two, of literature and writing. The literature for me was just trying to find time to support writing, and I had two professors, one who was very much what you just said, writing professor, wanted me, he said, we're not trying to write literature here. He just wanted straightforward stuff that he could sell and get himself some support for tenure at the university. The other guy was Paul West, who was a noted novelist, won several awards, is a belletristic writer, loves the kind of lyrical and rich writing. And he was very supportive, but I think he also, as you say, it was still somewhere within what he was looking for. I think he was extremely grateful when I wrote something that excited him, but, trying to find your own path through the wilderness is what it's all about.
I just finished reading Paul West's 4-volume sheer fiction series, and his essay on defending purple prose.
Yes.
Kind of feels like a manifesto that I can relate to on the level of kindred spirits almost.
Yeah, I would say that
so
was.
What kind of classes did you take with him exactly?
I took all creative writing classes. He had essay writing classes and fiction writing classes, and basically he said, you write anything you want, because essentially everything is fiction anyway. He just wanted good writing, and he wanted it to do more than the norm, what was expected. He was, extremely encouraging. He could read the dictionary and make it sound incredibly eloquent. He loved language, loved words. As far as a professor, in an hour and a half seminar, maybe a 3 hour with half an hour break, he could spend the entire 3 hours extemporizing, and whether you were with him or not, it didn't matter. And sometimes if you followed him, it was really, really exquisite, because he could make you understand the value of the placement of a single word in an entire page or chapter. He could dwell on the meaning or the purpose of a single word in a book, and it was really quite a show.
That sounds like the writer I've been spending a good deal of time with, and I read his short story collection, The Universe and Other Stories, and I've sort of been saving his novels for our rainy day, but that rainy day needs to come sooner rather than later. But how did you get from having your very first manuscript, Unbabbling, and connecting with Dalkey and John O'Brien?
That was just good luck, and actually my wife. Interesting, I think it has taken you the same amount, the time it took Odysseus to make his way back to Ithaca. It took me 10 years to finish that book, and it was mostly writing at night after a full day of landscaping. and a lot of soul searching and figuring it out.
And John O'Brien, he saw something in it that maybe other publishers didn't.
Yeah, in fact, what happened was he had just published a translation of the Brazilian writer Osmond Lean's book that my wife had done. And she said, when I finished unbabbling, why don't you just try him? And so I did. I sent it completely, and this was possible then, I sent it directly to the press, to John O'Brien. I did not tell him about my wife's work in the translation or anything, and made sure that there was no possible connections. He called up out of the blue, and he was really excited about it, and that was it. He actually asked me at the time if I had read Last Exit to Brooklyn, and I had not at the time, but he seemed to see a comparison between that, Hugh Selby, and I later read that book, and I saw the connection somewhat. I mean, not quite that, but yeah, he was really, and he encouraged me to submit my next novel to him, and I did 10 years later, and so that went.
It's great to be able to have that connection early on, but there was the gap that I wanted to ask you about. 20 years after Unbabbling until we get Margarito and the Snowman. You said you were writing Inflation. What else were you doing at that time? I mean, it wasn't exactly a sabbatical, was it?
No, it wasn't a sabbatical. I wish it was. I went from an outside job, landscaping, to an inside job that fried my brain every fucking day. And for me to go home at night and write was nearly impossible. I tried. I worked on the weekends as much as I could. I know there are other people out there who have completed much more heroic tasks under much more difficult circumstances, but man, it was, literally fried brain every day. I'd go home, say, okay, I'm going to get this done, and it was so difficult. But in the process, I was doing a lot of the work on Margarito and the Snowman and the trilogy, developing, writing. I finished this book called Inflation. I can't remember when. I submitted it to Dalkey 10 years after Unbabbling. And again, John initially was excited about it, John O'Brien, and then his readers killed it. I think one of them must have hated it, maybe somebody who liked Unbabbling, but so that was a little bit disappointing to say the least. And so, I continued to work on it, resubmitted. Then I just shelved it while I continued to work. I was beginning to work on the other books too that would come out, the Aaron Smith and book I'm working on now. I've always kind of worked, or at least I used to in the past, on multi-projects, work as far as I could in one until it dead ended, and then I would pick up another one and do the same.
And then you'd circle back.
Right, exactly.
One of the main cruxes of this trilogy is, especially the first part, is the concept of a perpetual Christmas that's fueled by artificial snow. It's a dystopia. And it reminded me of what Christopher Hitchens said about the culture of Christmas in America. And he compared it to living in North Korea, a country that he visited a couple times, if not more, in which all you hear is music in praise of the Father and the Son. Music, icons, etc. Can you comment on that and just talk about the idea of a perpetual Christmas and how you came about that and how it informs the work?
First of all, Christopher Hitchens, yeah, the contrarian's contrarian. That comparison is just a little bit skewed, though I like it a lot, especially the Father and the Son and the comparison with the Kim family. But at the time, whenever Christopher Hitchens made those remarks in his speech, he at that time, I think, had already visited, I know at least once or maybe twice, North Korea. Well, I think that the comparison between, first of all, he refers to the weeks surrounding the Christmas holidays here, and now it's grown into months, literally. So we're sort of approaching the year-round calendar of North Korea. The other thing is that in North Korea, then and now even more so, while they were singing the praise of the Father and the Son and putting on their best faces and polished faces every day, they were not getting Christmas presents, and they are not getting Christmas presents under the tree now. They are getting fairly nasty sacks of coal, and that's the way it has always been. So I think the comparison is just a little bit benign and, as I said, skewed, because what I am mostly getting, and I mean, who knows, maybe we, the United States, are headed in that direction where it will become that autocratic reality. That's certainly the big fear now. But, yeah, I mean, our Christmas experience here is of course, gross consumer capitalism and excess, all encouraged by the industries that be, mostly for their own gain, just looking at the number of billionaires in this country and the enormous disparity of wealth and distribution of wealth. So that's a lot of what I was getting at, the over-consumerism in this country, and how basically what we've come to is year-round Christmas or year-round holiday that encourages this, immediate gratification, all of those things. And in a state that, again, mine was much more benign. My concept, this dystopia, is not... while it's certainly expected that you will participate in the Christmas, you aren't going to be taken out and shot, not just yet if you don't, unlike North Korea. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a very clever comparison. It's kind of a lot of fun, Christopher Hitchens, could be a real asshole and got a lot of things terribly wrong, but that one was nice.
So within the novel, the holiday is also about covering up the reality. I'm now thinking of Aldous Huxley's theories of propaganda. There's true propaganda, false propaganda, and the propaganda of the unreal, which is designed to distract people from any sense of reality. And there's this invention of snow, which is literally covering the poverty and the pollution within this world.
That's exactly it. Playing on nostalgia while creating the mechanisms in bureaucracy and government that allow the possibility of this to happen, playing on that nostalgia for Christmas and winter wonderlands and all that, insidiously and gradually, this industry, the snow industry, takes over the country and it becomes a government entity. And yes, the whole point is to go out and cover up all the things we don't want to see, poverty, inequality, and things like that beneath the snow. Make everything pure and white. That is the whole idea.
Literal whitewashing.
Exactly. That is it. Literal whitewashing.
What about Christmas as a kid? Did you have happy times? I mean, for the longest time, I was pretty cynical about Christmas. And then I sort of realized that's because I come from a broken family, and I guess Christmas on some level reminded me of when we did have those few happy times in the past. Now I'm trying to develop a less cynical outlook. But what's your perspective on this holiday?
Well, kind of like yours, except I've relented, and I don't give a good goddamn if people want to enjoy their Christmas or any other holiday in the world and any other culture or anything. Fine, just leave me out of it. I am extremely cynical. My family was not exactly broken apart. We weren't much of a family, kind of a den of animals. And this short story, A Perfect Day for Banana Fish?
Who wrote that?
Raise High, the Roof Beam Carpenters, it's Franny and Zoe.
Salinger?
Yes, of course, Salinger.
Yes.
Yeah, he has that line. It's the name of a short story, I believe, Perfect Day for Banana Fish, and it may be in which the older brother commits suicide. I can't think. The Glass family. Well, Christmas was the perfect day for banana fish. It was supposed to be the one day of the year where everybody was happy, whether you liked it or not. And it was never happy. It was ugly because my father was a raging monster and a lunatic, and threatened to kill me pretty much every day of my life. And Christmas would always go wrong. Something would get fucked up one way or the other in his mind, and so that was it. So every year, and one of the nicest things was there was presents. We had a very beloved aunt, spinster aunt, who sent us lots of presents. But as the fireplace dimmed and turned cold at night, so did the holiday and my memory of all of that stuff. And I began to become increasingly cynical until I just saw all of it as that way. Again, go out and enjoy it if you want to. I live right now in a neighborhood that has been gentrified, and there are a bunch of extremely privileged and well-to-do people. And I see them spend thousands of dollars for Christmas decorations. I can't even imagine what they spend for presents. Commercialism. That's always been the association, and the emotional side, the beloved Christmas carols and things from youth. Extremely cynical.
There's plenty of branding in the trilogy.
Yeah.
Even in the last volume, the Pops, which are FDA-approved summertime ice cream treats. And that reminded me, all this consumerism and the name branding in particular reminded me of Don DeLillo's White Noise, which he had won at the title Panasonic. It often has paragraphs of name brands and credit card types, etc. Have you read White Noise? Was that an influence? Or
That's the only thing of DeLillo's I've read. And to be honest, I think I must be the only person in America who doesn't get it. It just seemed, sure, right, you're right. But it just seemed so light on the surface. And I may be wishing for a fatwa here, a death warrant or something for saying this, but I don't get it. And the funny thing is that Pynchon, who I absolutely love, one of the, I think, two greatest writers in the English language, modern language, he, I believe, is a real fan of DeLillo's, and especially White Noise. So that's a little odd to me, but
I do think White Noise is a great novel, but it's not necessarily my favorite. Underworld, I think, is his monolithic masterpiece, which I would recommend. See if that goes down easier in a sense.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, because that's what always works for me. Sometimes I may misread an author or get the wrong vibe, and then somebody will come along and say to me, yeah, but try this, or give it another look. And, sometimes happily I find myself mistaken, or I find something really good about something else. So you're right.
I mean, how do you feel about branding in general? Because on the one hand, there's the illusion of choice, too many choices. On the other hand, you have empty shelves, or, and then I'm thinking of branding on books. We wouldn't necessarily want to have a blank cover, although I know some people who would argue for that. And then there's the publisher Fitzcarraldo. All their books are white text and then totally blue background. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I am really kind of indifferent to textual fireworks, the presentation on the page. It can be fun, Tristram Shandy, whatever. That House of Leaves, which has some really fine stuff. But as far as, basically I want the text and, the other stuff, adornments, unless maybe it's a medieval manuscript or something like that, or the Dead Sea Scrolls, with some salt still on them. But branding is, to me, branding, of course, has always existed thousands of years ago. There was this wine from Crete, or this, these olives from, probably Crete too, but actually in Pompeii you can read graffiti that is a couple of thousand years old on the walls outside of what were vendors' stands or shops, and probably there was branding then. And then, of course, more in modern times, there are things like perfumes and clothing and all this stuff, that have been associated, just, for probably back in even the 17 or at least 1800s when courtiers and all these people began, there's probably branding. In fact, it was, I mean, people, whatever kind of product it was, clothing or alcoholic beverages or whatever. So now it's a multitude of branding, and there's an album, kind of a jazzy blues album called Multiplicity that has rabbits on the cover. And it is like that branding. In fact, it's an inundation, and it happens so quickly. I don't know how anybody remembers one brand from one day to the next, or what the purpose of it is. Selling brands, so much, again, of this seems to be selling a concept, and oftentimes an empty caloric concept. Branding means nothing to me. I don't have any fucking idea, as far as covers of books, I'm all for just a title on a simple, little South American or European publications, just a 5x7 book, very small print, cheap as possible, get it out to the masses.
You mentioned your admiration for Pynchon, and I've heard it said that an author like Pynchon cannot exist in the sense of being able to find any sort of wide readership these days, that it's a necessary evil, the branding of the writer. Do you think that's true?
Oh, man, yeah. It's probably the thing that got me into writing, or something. I was seduced by the concept, the whole idea of the writer, that went back to especially people like Hemingway and Fitzgerald and Faulkner, the writer, and how much they were glorified and what that meant. And I would say, that began to decrease considerably through about the mid last century, where, people like Mailer maybe, and some Updike or Roth, people like that continued for some time. But increasingly, I don't have much sense of anybody out there, a name that has that value, like, for example, Pynchon or Pynchon, where immediately, like him or not, most people still know who Pynchon is. And the fact is, he takes some work. Reading Gravity's Rainbow takes some work, not just because it's a big book, but you have to really think about what you're reading, because nothing in there is gratuitous. He gets slighted for digressions and for a lot of stuff, but he makes it all vital. In fact, as vital as the endnotes in Infinite Jest of David Foster Wallace. And there's a book talking about branding, and a name. David Foster Wallace is probably the last name that I can think of that was, a brand that has any consequence.
Yeah. I'm looking at my custom case that encloses my signed copy of Infinite Jest.
Bravo.
He's sitting with his big dog with the chain collar, and there's some tennis rackets in the back. My favorite author photo. So I guess, I understand what you're saying. There's certainly a zeitgeist around David Foster Wallace, where he was capturing the birth of the internet, which would go on to continually transmogrify into something like Infinite Jest, even if not a videotape per se.
That's a really impressive work. I'm not a fan of his other work. I've read essays. I looked at The Broom of the System. I read Pale King. But everything in my mind falls short of that work, which is a complete work. It's really comprehensive and really, really brilliant work. There are, as with anything, you can find flaws. You can argue against certain choices, etc. But it's an amazing execution of a concept.
I agree. I think had he lived and then further worked on The Pale King, he could have approached Infinite Jest. It's almost there. And there's a certain bravery in exploring the concept of boredom the way he does in The Pale King. But
yeah, that's the thing. For me, that didn't work. I liked one page in that book. There's a page pretty near the beginning where this young couple who are considering, I think, an abortion, maybe by a pond, and he describes the sky as being like a used flash bulb, that they used to have on cameras, and it was perfect image. It's a little bit like Neuromancer, they're beginning the description of the sky like a TV screen. It's just that compelling. But the rest of the book, where he was working so hard to give us the tedium and boredom of working for the IRS and through this particular character who exhibits a number of David Foster Wallace's personality quirks or traits, it was not working for me, because it's the old adage, if you want to write about something boring, that boring should be just exhilarating or enormous, just compelling, incredible. It should not be boring. And that's, unfortunately, I felt like I was reading, as I did with later Pynchon works, unfortunately, I felt like I was reading the blueprints for a greater work that I did not see happening. I think he had, his personal demons and all those things you and everybody else are probably aware of. I think they were becoming insurmountable. His problems with substance abuse and the expectations of another great work like Infinite Jest. His person, he was obviously tormented, and he also had quite a bit of to do with John O'Brien, Dalkey Archive Press, and Steve Moore. Steve Moore, in fact, I did a lot of editing on his work, and a lot of cross connections.
I mean, he did want to subtitle Infinite Jest a failed entertainment, and the publisher said, no, it's not a failed entertainment. And
no, it's not.
Even though that fits with the theme of the book. But, I mean, again, there's this relativity where plenty of people would consider Infinite Jest boring. So, yeah, I mean, it's a little complex, that continuum. But as far as going back to the concept of a celebrity writer, do you think the trade-off is worth it to have this kind of mascot type of branding, but if it leads to people reading the work, that it's worth it?
Well, yes. If it brings people to good literature, to read good literature, yes. But again, how do you essentially have to do the testing yourself? You've got to pick up the book and read it and determine what you think about it. And so, given how much is published every year in America alone, much less in translation, it's keeping abreast of so much work, and doing all the filtering and selection is difficult. And brand names, how trustworthy are they? And also the fact that a brand brings with it that huge consumer enterprise. Thinking of Harry Potter novels, books, whatever series, and things like that. There's I can't. Sorry. The woman, Donna, somebody wrote
Donna Tartt.
Donna Tartt. I think she somewhat approaches that. I don't know, because I honestly don't have a very good idea of what's going on in writing and literature in this country, in the world, anywhere now, because, again, there's just so much, and I'm committed to my own work. But I read that book, whenever, more or less after it came out, recommended by people. There are some issues I have with it, but, she's a good writer, and so it's a lot of really good writing in there. In fact, very, compelling writing. That
maybe it was naive of me as a younger reader to go by blurbs, but I've been led astray many a time with a blurb by a writer whom I admire, Salman Rushdie, for instance, or even a Don DeLillo blurb, and then the book turns out to be tepid.
Salman Rushdie is one of those writers like Paul West, who when you hear him read, you think, man, this guy's pretty close standing next to God. I mean, it makes it sound incredible. But when you begin to read it on your own, then it's like, well, because one of my biggest arguments about a lot of contemporary writing that I have been exposed to is that a lot of people have nothing to say and no guts to say it. There are a lot of smart people out there with huge vocabularies, maybe even excellent pedigrees, maybe down and out hard luck stories, but finding somebody who really has the fucking balls to say something important, to take on what's going on in life and the world and personal relationships and whatever, and working with that and bringing the whole human circus into play, the good and the bad, which for me personally, I like light and darkness, and I generally have been working in slapstick somewhat, cartoons. The whole trilogy is largely a big cartoon, but I go to very dark places, and even as somebody pointed out to me recently, tragic places. And I don't think many people who read my writing think of that. They mostly see it as like the slapstick and the humor and all that kind of stuff. But yeah.
My friend Mark, the author M.J. Nichols,
Yes.
he reviewed the first volume in your trilogy. He called it a post-Trump novel, if not the first post-Trump novel. Do you agree with that?
Well, most of that book was written long before Trump entered the picture, other than as the huckster and shiller that he was, the con man. But sure, I think, there's this inevitability in the direction of this country, where we're going, have been going for some time, and probably the vacuum had been created and Trump fell into it, and there he is. And now for the last 8 years and maybe 4 more years, every fucking day is Trump world. And
as he continued to hold his Nuremberg rallies,
yeah.
as it were, did you see yourself changing anything with the novel?
No, absolutely not. I had in mind all along kind of a forever president who was, autocratic and capricious and out of touch, and at some point taking the world kind of with him. But no, Trump, it's unfortunate for us that he dominates the world because he's such a minor player. The guy is such a punk.
So, yeah, because I was wondering if at any point you considered having Trump as a character at the forefront of the trilogy.
Well, okay, I confess that in the book I'm working on now and hope to finish in the relatively near future, there is a section called Cloud Cuckoo Land, which you might recognize from. Yeah, and that's where the Trump family and the Trump minions and the Trump world exists, out in this cloud, in this gilded palace. And so right now, there's a place for him in this book. I don't know if that's going to stay there. I don't know how I'll feel about that, but
in a sense, he's unavoidable, for worse or worse.
yeah, that's correct. Yeah, I mean, just look at it. Every day, all day, Trump.
You mentioned how your earlier work evolved, if that's the right word, and I asked you, in what sense did it change or alter from then to now? In your email to me, you said it's more playful, less restricted by externally imposed boundaries or self-censorship. And then you said, I'm less hesitant to step off the cliff when taking risks. The biggest thing is probably that I enjoy the hell out of the entire writing process, even trying to solve the most frustrating pretzel logic plot twists, all the hows and whys and wheres and whens.
Yeah, unbabbling is actually kind of the roadmap to my writing, where it has been and where it's gone, because in the first it's broken into 3 sections too. In the first section is very dark, and that's the Hugh Selby thing that John O'Brien saw. The final section is much more playful, and when I finished that book, I thought I had come out of the darkness into the light. Turned out not to be true, because then following, as I said, were those 20 years wandering in the wilderness. But I found my way back to humor, to playfulness, to all of those elements which are really useful and beneficial to writers, to anybody in the arts, to anybody who wants to enjoy life more than as a drab North Korean experience.
What do you mean by self-censorship in this context?
Well, self-censorship is something I have observed in many writers to be the writer that I was, and that is second-guessing and questioning choices for fear of offending somebody, of not pleasing somebody, of not writing the way somebody would like you to write, of meeting expectations or not. Exactly that, finding your own path and pursuing it, and full speed ahead, and the devil be damned.
And reader be damned?
You know what? If it comes to that, my audience is me. I write for myself, only for myself. The one thing I keep in mind is, and E.M. Forrester has this line in Howard's End, only to connect. That's the writer's job, is to connect with the reader. How well you do that is the success of your writing. If the reader has no use for me, I have no use for that reader. But sure, I would love everybody to. I have a very good friend. She never went to college. She worked an entire lifetime career in horticulture and landscaping. She's an intelligent person, and she's very open-minded. She has read all of my books, including the most recent one, and she has absolutely zero problem understanding them, picking up on the humor, getting the perspective, everything. So, I think the biggest thing that you want out of a reader is somebody to approach your work with an open mind and let the work teach them how to read it. That would be true of Pynchon in Gravity's Rainbow, for example. That would be true of Joyce in Ulysses, for example. Arno Schmidt, any work that's more difficult or challenging or requires some thinking other than simply going along for the ride like you're on a train or at the movies.
I took 3 months to do a deep read of Ulysses with the Gifford Guide and the new Bloomsday book, dual wielding those two crutches, as it were. And just from a standpoint of being realistic, I suppose, it's a lot to ask of a reader to do that. Most people aren't even in the position to have the time or the energy. Like you said, when you were working your proletarian job, you were completely exhausted afterward. I don't know where I'm going with this. It just came to me. But, society doesn't seem set up to support artists on the whole, and it isn't set up to encourage a kind of leisure time, an intellectual leisure time. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, I would say that kind of intellectual leisure time is discouraged because thinking is discouraged. To read a work like Gravity's Rainbow or Ulysses takes work, and nobody's asking you to do it. But if you want to have an incredible experience, to expand your mind, and to learn a hell of a lot about humanity and the way humanity exists, the way the mind works, these are great books. The biggest thing, the most important thing, again, is approaching a work with an open mind and wanting more than the standard sugary cereal, breakfast cereal, or whatever, or peanut butter and jelly sandwich, or gallon of ice cream, or whatever. Life isn't easy, and it's important that a lot of art is not easy, because it makes people think, it challenges their preconceptions, and all those things we know. Getting the horse to the water and making them drink, that's where education in this country really fails us, because creative thinking is not encouraged. One of the things I was doing when I was working in the wilderness was scoring standardized tests, essays, reading them, appointing a score, giving it a score, and determining its value, and reading hundreds of those essays every single day. And they're scoring them with AI, artificial intelligence, instead of human readers. And what they're looking for, what they really want, and what they impose on students in school, because they teach to the test, is a very standard structure, very rigid structure. Introduction, 3-paragraph, conclusion. And they're not interested in creativity. They're not interested in somebody who can really write well. In fact, that might be a mistake, because if you're able to write more complex sentences, you might confuse the AI as it exists now. Sometimes it even confuses the human scorers, who are a little bit beneath their level, reading something really good work.
Speaking of AI, that's certainly something that is more and more relevant. And there's talk of AI novels, AI films. Sticking to the novel as a form, I'm thinking of how the invention of photography, caused art to become more abstract. Do you think this technology of AI writing fiction will cause a shift in the novel as a form to become perhaps more abstract, more complicated, more Pynchonian even?
If it becomes more Pynchonian or more abstract or complex, it might be by accident, as the AI is fumbling its way through possibilities, infinite algorithms and that kind of thing. But I don't know,
human writers making their novels that way, as opposed to the simplistic, minimalist James Patterson type, Stephen King type novels that the AI will regurgitate.
Do you mean that writers would intentionally try to
differentiate themselves from what AI is capable of?
Well, they may not be able to. And that's a funny point. But I was going to say that AI is inevitable. Technology, the advances or changes, whether they're advances or not, I don't know, but changes are inevitable. And that's where we're going. And so will writing even be not even essential or necessary? Will it even exist as a tool anymore? I don't know. The more synaptic leap between the human brain and the machine, the more that develops, there may be less need for any actual coded or for any kind of language between them. It may just be entirely electric. I don't know. One thing you said there about photography is very interesting, because film in particular has taken over much of the narrative that used to exist in writing. Before film, people read novels and their imagination took them on the journey, the voyage. They traveled wherever the writer took them, and their minds, opened up and expanded on that. In film, everything is given to you. You have all the visuals presented simultaneously. You have everything, the character, the setting, the scenery. You have a score in the background to give you a melodramatic or dramatic texture. You can almost taste it, sniff and taste the screen now, what's going on. So you have all these things that a writer, it takes pages to accomplish. And that may be one of the reasons for the impatience with writing now, given film, and also quick cut editing, and whether it's in commercials on TV or in film. If it moves so fast, there isn't the time to think about things or ponder them. And maybe that's even the way, again, evolution. Everything moves so much faster now with technology. So humans just have to catch up or keep up, and maybe they can't, and maybe that's the end of humanity. Maybe that's the direction we're supposed to be going. Isaac Asimov had a short piece called The Final Question, and it's basically covers humanity from 2001: Space Odyssey, apes discovering this monolith, to the end of time and the beginning of time again. It's a very interesting piece.
I agree that, film can be, and it often is, a passive experience, especially compared to the act of reading. But one of the few David Lynch films I hadn't seen, and I watched recently, finally, Inland Empire, which is very much a 3-hour odyssey of the psyche. It gives you those elements, but they're very much jumbled, decoded, or coded, and the whole experience begs rewatching, decoding, and thinking on a deep level that could almost be on par with a complex novel, if not more so.
With that, I agree entirely. You are right. A very good, more challenging film does do that, and that is one of the things about a really great film that makes it a great film. It does engage and make you find meaning, reconstruct meaning in the viewer's mind. Paul West, going back to Paul West one time in a class, we were talking about digressions and nonlinear writing, and he said something, and I said, well, the truth, in fact, in the end, everything is linear, because in the end, the viewer, the reader, the reader is always going to have to assemble all these parts into meaning that is linear. Where is who did what happened, where did it come from, where did it go? But nevertheless, I agree with you. Film can be very challenging. It has a shorter time period to do that in. It does present the viewer with a lot of the elements to do this work. But some are, just really wonderfully challenging. Figuring out what the director is doing.
And the whole sort of frame tale of your trilogy is that it's a film that is simultaneously being shown, edited, and directed, recorded. Where did that come from? Do you have a filmmaking aspiration?
No, I don't. really love good film. I mean, I remember sitting in a movie theater when I was 12 or 13 years old, my older brother, on a matinee during the day. Well, actually, I remember some of those matinees from when I was like 5 or 6 years old. Like parents just like letting us roam, and we'd end up in the theater or something and just watching. But no aspirations. But I really, film is compelling. There was this little one of the great independent movie theaters in Austin years ago. We began every showing with this little expression in many languages that film is the universal language, and you don't have to speak the language to understand a lot of what happens in film. And going back to Joyce, the ineluctable modality of the visual, it's right there in your face, and it's if it's really compelling and it's a good film, a great film, it really does the job. And but for me, film, it just turned out to be serendipitous, an opportunistic thing for me. Whenever I began to develop Margarito from short stories and vignettes into this larger piece, didn't really seem to have a governing principle, and there were also lots of gaps that needed to be filled. And if I tried to do that in a logical and the normal sequencing and narrative, it seemed wooden, and it wasn't a lot of fun for me. And out of nowhere, Boone Weller appeared, the B-movie director, and suddenly I could do anything I wanted. I could be all over the map, and it was all his fault. Time problems, chronological mishaps, characters suddenly, appearing when they shouldn't, or whatever. Anything could happen because it was all the director's fault. And so it was, for me, an enormous crutch. You used the word crutch earlier. Kind of a crutch, yeah.
You mentioned B-movies throughout. Are there particular inspirations or even companion films that you would cite for this trilogy?
I wouldn't say directly anything, because at this point, for me, everything influences me. Everything in the Matrix, anything I can pull from, anything I see, has almost equal value. But in terms of film, sure, there are a number of great B-movie films, directors out there. That just immediately come to mind. Tarantino, certainly. Jodorowsky, Ed Wood, John Waters, Tim Burton, Terry Gilliam, Jim Jarmusch. People who were all over the map doing incredibly creative things, who still are in some cases. Tarantino's Django Unchained, you put that back to back with 12 Years a Slave, and it's incredible, because Tarantino is somebody who pushes the limits of humor. There's this horrible lynching scene where these pig-fucking hillbillies are laughing, just smirking while they're hanging these two guys. And it's so real. The sense of this, the horror of these half-witted idiots who are killing these innocent people, and it's all a joke to them. And Tarantino is presenting us in that way, and it makes me think of Toni Morrison's Beloved, because that book is absolutely beautiful and filled with horror, and so she is painting horror in beautiful terms. And there's a little scene like that again in Pynchon's V, where there is this young Herrera woman who is a sexual slave, and Pynchon's description of the scene of her skin color, it's beautiful, and it's enmeshed in this heart. And so there are plenty of people out there. Tim Burton, is more lighthearted, silly. Gilliam, Brazil, that's a film that did influence me quite a bit. I really like that film, the irony and the ending, where you think all along this guy's finally finding escape, and it's just a fantasy.
There are two allusions to Rosa's The Devil to Pay in the Backlands.
Right.
Which I kind of homed in on because it's quite a rare book that's been out of print for decades. I think you mentioned your wife's translator.
Yes.
You mentioned Oz Mandolins.
Yeah, and one of the more challenging writers, more interested in the workings behind the scene.
Did she introduce you to this novel?
Yeah, in fact, she introduced me to a whole another dimension and world, and that is the world of Latin America, and that's both Spanish and Portuguese. Yeah, I mean, some of the greatest. The Devil to Pay in the Backlands, the translations. I have not read that book. I almost feel that I have because of my wife talking about it. But
is she working on a translation? I know that someone was working on a new translation.
No, she isn't. And I don't know anything about that. But I had some. We've traveled in that area and had some pretty good idea of. I've read a bit of Brazilian literature and seen a number of Brazilian films, but the thing in Latin American literature that really turned me on was Marquez and 100 Years of Solitude and Autumn of the Patriarch. When I read those books, in translation, unfortunately, I'm hoping to get around to them in Spanish as I'm working on that. But that was truly an event. I just went into another place in the world and life. And it's not just the magic realism, it's the magic of the writing, the incredible flow, the river of language, some of the things he did, for example, with dialogue. When he introduces a character, he doesn't give you all these taglines, and he says the character just starts speaking out of nowhere, and it just is part of the whole textual flow. But the language, the love of language, the richness, the characters, all of that stuff, was just an enormous revelation. And then since then, I've read quite a number of works in, mostly unfortunately in translation, but Latin American, from Argentinian and Brazilian and Colombian and Chilean and Cuban, just a lot. There's just across the board a real richness, generally a real richness and love of language and culture.
Oh, yes. The Latin writers, they were on a whole other level. And even Paul West was very enamored with them. And the first volume of his sheer fiction is almost wholly dedicated to the Latin American writers. Did he mention that at all back in the day? Or?
Yeah, he was kind of a voice in the wilderness himself for that, because especially Marquez was just starting to really be known. But in fact, Borges came and spoke at Penn State, and West was in the audience and asked him what turned out to be really an inane question, because Borges just brushed him off. Paul West asked him what his 10 favorite words were, and in so many words, Borges just dismissed them. There is no such thing. All words, all words have their function and beauty, etc. But of course, West was he was a cosmopolitan. He was open to everything. He was always searching and reading, and he was aware. If he gave us a reading list, it was. I don't even remember if there was a single American writer on it, 50 writers or something, and they were all Latin American, European.
He was not as impressed with American writers from what I understand. And his alliance was with writers like William H. Gass.
Yeah.
Very small circle of writers who, like you were saying before, don't dilute their vision for external reasons. And speaking of diluting one's vision, and I'm not saying you're diluting your vision, but there is a hyper-awareness, meta-awareness with some of the humor in your trilogy, which is obviously purposeful. Can you talk about that? And I'm talking specifically about, say, when a character is having this kind of cartoonish Spanish accent, for instance, or even a kind of Ebonic accent. Can you talk about that and the limits of humor?
the only limits of humor are the limits that humor finds. I think of Lenny Bruce and Richard Pryor and Red Fox and George Carlin and even the Smothers Brothers. You can push things as far as you can, and either you lose your audience or you get smacked down by Big Brother or whatever. Humor is a wonderful tool. Accents, voice, vocalization can't be. As far as accents themselves go, for me, that is kind of a, to use some of those terms I don't like, such as metatextual or postmodern, I'm generally referring to times in American history whenever things like accents appeared commonly in almost all forms of culture. I mean, any kind of humor program on TV or stand-up comedy or anything. There was a time when the Jewish shtick was really big, and it was mostly by Jewish comedians. Even now, stand-up comics, you always hear them making fun of parodying Eastern European speakers. The world is a cosmopolis of culture and language and accents, and mostly filtered through English, and especially American English. And so it's unavoidable that if you travel or if you go anywhere off the farm in America, you're going to hear accents now. And it isn't always easy to understand what is being said or where these people are coming from. And that can be off-putting, it can be unsettling, it can be scary. But for me, it's just a fact of life, and I'm trying to, because I mostly think in terms of the world beat, the world literature, the world, we're all in this together. And all of these languages, the accents, are meant simply to represent this, but in, generally a humorous way, more in the tradition of the kind of humor, the stand-up comedy especially, where it was not unusual at all, but also, in all kinds, everybody, Pynchon, going back to Pynchon, but practically who did not use, even well-known writers use accents to some extent. In terms of ebonics, you're talking about book 3, the Snow Biz. I know that for somebody who would read that section with a particular character with whom ebonics are used, I don't know, it depends on the reader. Somebody could take great offense, and I'm sure they will, cultural appropriation, whatever, or maybe some unintentional racist bent. I have no idea. But for me, it is, it's exactly the opposite. It's the reverse psychology of the way this is perceived in society today. First of all, you shouldn't be doing that, making, fun of somebody's culture. I'm not. And two, to say, especially in that book, because that particular character you're talking about, Sister Sun Ray, is this larger-than-life TV personality who is nonstop challenging people's tolerance for humor. How far can it go? And especially the white audiences. Her audiences are largely white rather than black. And so everything that traditionally has made white society more comfortable with black society fits into stereotypes of mannerisms, speech, dress. And if you go outside of that, it's very unsettling to white society, especially non-urban, I would say. So I'm using all of these things as tools, as ways to gain entrance, to challenge, to rethink. Mostly, I think I am just having fun playing with these things, and I hope that it is really working that way. But again, with my work, like I say, light and darkness, humor is a vehicle that is more inviting, and in the process, I work in the real dark stuff that I think is absolutely requires our attention.
And of course, there's just the linguistic element of an accent, and having, even as kids, babies, we have that proclivity toward echolalia and mimicking sounds. So I guess it all depends on intent, but intent and subtext and context is often lost on the lazy, stupid reader. So You mentioned you've traveled to Greece on at least more than one occasion. What can you tell me about that?
Well, yes, my wife and I have traveled to Greece a number of times now, several years in fact, and for periods from, say, 3 weeks to a couple of months. My wife is from Italy and has always liked that part of the Mediterranean world, and really, drew me towards it. And so many things are, again, going back to that interest in classical literature and culture. I remember reading a National Geographic one copy that was about retracing Odysseus' path back to Ithaca from Troy, and it just absolutely infatuated me, the whole concept of this, retracing the steps of Odysseus himself, and having read the Iliad and the Odyssey. That was really a big part of it. And when you travel around Greece, you cannot take a step without stepping on culture, without stepping on artifacts, and it's fascinating with even elements of modern Greek. You can read words in Greek on carved into marble, from thousands of years ago. So much of culture, of history, originates in ancient and classical Greece. All of the obvious things, science, culture, etc., and that. So I always was really fascinated and interested. It just didn't really seem like a possibility when I was younger to do that, to go travel and explore, and we have, and there are just I'm pretty sure, as with any country, that you get to know that seems exotic or distant or something, you find so many fascinating things. But Greece happens to be beautiful. So many parts of it are beautiful. It has so many different ecosystems, so many different physical features. Of course, the sea and the islands and things like that are just fascinating. But
as you know, I just finished my Odysseus length novel.
Yes.
Second novel after 10 years, and at the end of the month I'll be in Greece thanks to funding from the Tom Lafarge Award for Innovative Writing, and I'll be doing in-depth research for what I'm calling the Greek novel. I mean, it has a tentative title, but I'm calling it the Greek novel for short. So I'm curious, is there any Greek novel that could come from your adventures?
Well, I liked Z a lot. You might remember the book and the movie Z. And the same author wrote another book that is extremely playful, and it's escaping my mind right now. But I have read a fair number of contemporary books, and I can't say that I've really been wowed by a lot. But something I have had an awful lot of fun with is a series of detective novels by Petros Markaris, and trying to even read some of it in Greek. But they're just, it's just, having spent a good bit of time in Athens, his books are mostly centered in Athens, and so everything is very familiar. And it's a real pleasure to hear him just offhandedly remarking about places around Athens that you're familiar with. Vasilis Vasilikos wrote and it was turned into a movie by Costa Gavras, the movie Z, and it's amazing because it's an extremely raw and gritty crime novel and movie, though the movie is somewhat more noir. But then he wrote, among others, The Few Things I Know About Glafkos Thrasakis. It's a very playful, intellectual, rich novel that is completely, utterly different than Z. So that's interesting. There's a guy, I'm getting his name wrong, Econonomus right now, who has 2 books of short stories out, which are very, again, kind of, one's more lyrical than the other, but kind of gritty about what the reality is of life on the islands. That on the one hand, for tourists, it's these beautiful kind of idyllic settings, but they're actually run by local mafias, and it's pretty brutal and nasty. And these short stories deal with that.
I'll have to check that out because I'll be reading, watching, and just immersing myself in Greek culture, and I'll be able to see some familiar places through my wife's eyes for the first time. She's never been to Greece. But I wanted to ask you a question that I ask all my guests, and that is, what is a book that has had the most profound effect on you, whether in your personal life, your writing life, or all of the above?
Well, as with so many things now, I no longer have any special anything that I think really influenced me or contributed to my own writing, or it's pretty much everything. I could read a children's novel now and it would probably have some profound effect. But yeah, of course, it's not just one, it's many. There was a period, Hemingway, Faulkner was an enormous, had a huge period, Faulkner period. Pynchon, of course, James Joyce, of course, some odd writers like Robbe-Grillet, the French writer, who wrote these convoluted, complex stories that were, fairly innovative and incredible. No, I really can't. Everything, I like it, like Infinite Jest, for example. By the time I read that, it wasn't. It was too late in the game for me to be really influencing me or anything. But I recognize it as a really brilliant work, and that's all I can really say now.
What about Gil Orlovitz? You mentioned him in the old interview that we published in the Kaleidoscope.
Oh, those books are incredible. Those books are, Milk Bottle H and F.
Ice Never F.
They are incredibly complex and require a lot of work and a lot of thought. And I think in some ways are probably equal to, on a more microscopic level, Joyce's Ulysses in what he is doing with language. And it's fascinating because the language is extremely fragmented, especially in Milk Bottle H. It takes a lot of work to figure out what the hell is going on. And basically the language, the disintegration of the text itself reflects a disintegration of the nuclear Jewish family in New York City around World War II and afterwards. And it's really fascinating. It's difficult reading, but it is worth it. I had that book, a friend gave it to me 40 years ago, 40 years ago, and I had it on my shelf for 30 years, and I kept looking at it and thinking, damn, that thing looks interesting. I just know it's got to be worth it, but nobody talks about it. And it turns out that John O'Brien really wanted to get his hands on that because the guy who wrote that book, apparently a hardcore alcoholic and a very difficult person, and his family disowned them and didn't want anybody to reprint the books because perhaps, there's something autobiographical in there. I don't know if it is. Who would know? It's so crazy. But man, they're brilliant. They're just fascinating. Well worth it. I wish somebody would, take that up again.
They were reprinted through Tough Poets Press.
Yeah, right. I remember you pointing that out. And yes, I don't know, how that is, if anybody's picked up on that or not. I don't know.
So I'd like to end with a reading from the final volume of your trilogy.
I'll begin with an epigraph that is not in the book, a tribute to Jack Kerouac. This is followed by the prologue, an exuberant, over-the-top circus barker sales pitch that should give the reader some sense of the tone and content of the book. This tone downshifts considerably on the first page when we are introduced to an aging snowman and his current incarnation as a kind of downtrodden ice cream pushcart salesman. We then move about a quarter of the way into the book where the snowman has a eureka moment that will completely change his destiny. Enjoy. There's a little alley in San Francisco. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight, live on stage, for your delectation and viewing pleasure, we present to you the blood-pounding, bongo-congo, drum-beating, bungo in the jungle tom-tom of the heart. The lights, camera, sound, and action, it's showtime, thrill of your life. Clown cars, flaming hoops, high-wire walking African elephants in pink tutus, right here under the big top, the big tent, on the big stage of the Bolshoi on Broadway Theater. And the land of milk and honey, the honey pot sweet spot, how I love you, mammy, the suckling mammary gland of wealth and power, the dragon horde, the capitalist swagger, the dance of finance, I mean M-O-N-E-Y, money, prestidigitated, pilfered, and pixelated before your very eyes. It's the snowbiz. An annoying on-again, off-again squealing sound that could be a bad fan belt in the theater's heating system is accompanied by a methodical slap, 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 slap. And on the screen we see a pair of feet shod and frayed and crumbling leather and tire-tread huaraches striking the pavement. The camera pulls back, and through the simmering fried egg morning haze we see a man in a faded Hawaiian shirt, palm trees and hula girls, and worn khaki cargo shorts pushing a classic three-wheeled ice cream cart with a top-hatted Frosty the Snowman and an identical Hawaiian shirt, palm trees, and yes it is, hula girls, painted on the side. He's got a couple days of salt and pepper beard stubble. His dirty blonde hair is infused with a watercolor wash of gray. Polarized wraparound sunglasses hide his eyes, but you can tell there's something weird about them. It's only 10 a.m., but the sun is already burning in the sky like an industrial heat lamp. Membranous waves of moist hot air swarm around him. Rivers of sweat pour from his body, soaking his shirt and trickling down his legs like embarrassing streams of pee. The slightly lopsided left wheel of his cart squeals at regular intervals. He's been meaning to stop at the bicycle shop on Guadalupe and ask Rick to have a look at it, maybe buy a new wheel if necessary. But instead of pursuing this idea in a logical fashion, like figuring how and when to fit this stop into his schedule, he drops down an etymological rabbit hole that begins with the word bicycle, which everybody and his grandmother knows is pronounced bicycle, even though we say motorcycle and unicycle as in scythe or psychopath. The camera draws in as his eyes brighten and a 5-watt refrigerator bulb goes on over his head, then shifts to a small glass bottle, or more accurately a vial, sitting on the spice shelf, as we now hear a faint echo from a 1950s Broadway classic, Maria, and for an instant we see that Maria, the auburn tresses, the big brown eyes, the purest snow-white dress with flaring skirts, immediately replaced by a punked-out version, chopped black hair streaked with crimson and henna, studs in her nose, eyebrows, upper lip, flannel shirt, charcoal gray jeans torn at the knees, Doc Martens, the badass Maria the Snowman knew, as she presses into his hand this same glass vial and says cryptically, "For when your recipe lacks a certain something." "You mean it's like a magic potion?" He thought he was being cute, but she didn't refute him. "Use it sparingly," she warned him. "Una gotita no más." He unscrews the cap and lets a single drop of the clear liquid fall into his concoction, gives it a stir and waits for something to happen. Nothing. It looks exactly the same. He sticks his finger in, licks it. Tastes the same too. Damn, it feels so close. He's right on the edge. But that edge has gotten a hell of a lot narrower thanks to that consummate old cutler, Father Time, as the camera now focuses on the long out-of-date day calendar sitting on the kitchen table, from which 2 or 3 pages flutter to the floor. "Come on, man," he shouts, invoking an aged U.S. president as he gives the tub a vigorous shake. Perhaps a nanosecond passes, however long it takes for that synaptic leap between stasis and action, Not exactly like watching for the pot to boil, more like striking a match, yes, Doc? Because now he can see something is happening. The sludge is growing and at a precipitous rate. A glowing, rainbow-colored atomic mushroom cloud, somewhat anthropomorphic in shape, swells up out of the zinc tub, expands toward the ceiling, slumps over onto the floor like a drunken genie, and continues growing. It's like the magic pot of porridge on full throttle, like a sixth-grade science project gone horribly awry. He grabs a ladle and starts, ladling this expanding blob into pots, pans, jars, glasses, anything at hand. In a frantic I Love Lucy reprise, he begins to jam spoonfuls in his mouth. And holy hot damn, this stuff is fucking awesome. There's all this fizzy, tingly, tangy stuff happening in his mouth and on his tongue, and then shazam! The most intense brain freeze he's ever experienced in his life slams him right between the eyes, and yow! This isn't just a hyperphasonic autonomous sensory meridian response. This is a fucking full-fledged big O brain orgasm. The world disintegrates into a kaleidoscope of tropical colors. A solar wind roars through his skull. The entire heavenly host is screaming, "Gloria!" And he feels wonderful. He's also about to drown in this rainbow-colored sludge. Meth has leapt from the kitchen table to the top of the refrigerator and back down to the sink, the whole time sounding the alarm. "Mert! Mert! Mert! Snowman, what are you doing? Make it stop!" But no, this incompetent human seems incapable of taking responsibility for his mess. It's up to the frantic feline, who very well may have been a witch's familiar in another lifetime, to tell this pot to knock it off. "Do you hear me, little pot? Stop! Meow!" Edward G. Robinson vocal imitation. And just like that, it does stop. After breaking out a window and barging through the kitchen side door the snowman hasn't used since it froze permanently shut during the protracted winter of Vicentic discontent. That's it.
Thank you, Ray.
You're welcome, George.
And thanks for the great conversation. Being on the show was a pleasure.
Yes, mine too.
There you have it. I hope you enjoyed my exchange with Ray. Be sure to support the author by picking up his recent trilogy. And feel free to check out the interview I published with Ray on the Kaleidoscope website in 2020. If you'd like early access to content like this and other awesome benefits, such as monthly book picks or even editorial services, then consider supporting the Kaleidoscope's efforts through patreon.com/The Kaleidoscope. There's always more content in the works, so stay tuned and thank you so much for your support. Together, we can make the unheard heard.